Hello, everyone. I'm KLMeri.
And I'm Soda.
We're back with a new podcast. This time we're going to be talking about Canon versus Fanon. Character traits, personality, physical attributes, some Canon versus Fanon as far as backstories, and in particular, any Fanon that is more popular than Canon. Soda, where do you want to start?
Let's start with the specific characters, and let's go to the general universe things.
Okay, that sounds good to me. When I was thinking about putting together this list, there's one thing that is at the top of my personal list. Okay, because I see the disparity so often in reading fan fiction, and as someone who writes fan fiction, I wanted to know what is right as far as canon, and then what is fanon. And it's the first thing on the list here. It's Spock's, internal temperature, his skin temperature. This one's a really interesting one to me because I have no idea how the Fanon theory came about. Because to me, Spock is, as he was portrayed in the show, and I think just from what I knew from reading novels and from reading Memory Alpha, I was always under the impression that Spock having a lower internal temperature was not only canon, nobody would ever assume that he was hot natured because of that.
Yeah, I think I can understand where this came from, the fanon.
Oh, please tell me.
Well, just the simple fact that Vulcan is a very, very warm place, and on Earth we're used to people or animals that live in very warm places have generally lower. Wait.
I know it's confusing, right?
They live in warm places, so they're used to warm temperatures, so they're less durable in colder temperatures, so they're more sensitive to cold. And that's, I think, where it came from, because, you know, I don't think the Fanon really cares about Spock having cold temperature as much as it cares about, him being sensitive to cold temperatures.
Here's what I find interesting. That's all true, okay? Because, yes, when you live in an arid desert environment, especially for, say, like reptiles or whatnot, it's very important that they maintain lower body temperatures. And for Vulcans, not only do they have a faster heart rate than humans, but they don't have sweat glands. So that means that
Is that canon though?
it is, or at least it's canon as far as published novelizations.
So that's the thing. I don't think the novels are technically canon. A lot of the novels also contradict themselves. Some novels that have different depictions of aliens and humans than the ones the other novels.
It's kind of a gray area because some of the novelizations, right? I mean, well, if you think about the novelizations, they are supported
Wait,
by
are you talking about the novelizations of the episodes or about novels?
either.
Mm.
Um, they're they're published, under legal copyright from
Yeah.
Paramount slash CBS, depending on, whether it's, reboot or original series or some other series. Um, to me, that's canon.
That's too, but also the fact that novels, especially of the original series, have been published steadily from the 60s to this day. And facts change as times change, because the way we see the future as time progresses changes. And as you said, there are a lot of different writers worked on them. And just because they're licensed, I don't think makes them canon. A lot of their facts are contradicted in the series themselves, different series. And I think most fans kind of agree that the live action series are canon. The movies are canon. Well, the new movies are like a different universe, but they're still canon to that universe. And the animation series might be a little of a gray area, but I think the novels are usually like pick and choose if you have to use them.
So, well, I think we can agree that fanon is definitely fan fiction.
Well,
Anything
yeah.
written in fan fiction. So I guess we kind of have to say, are TOS novels, for instance, just a published fan fiction?
That's the thing. I think a lot of people just consider them like uplifted fan fiction, like glorified fan fiction.
Okay. I'm So how do you want to pursue this conversation? Do you want to
I
stick
think we should keep
purely
them
to the canon
more.
definition? The
I,
the episodes, the movies, and maybe
I think
TAS.
that's the thing. I think that yeah, the canon should be like strictly the shows, the live action shows and movies. The animation, it's an interesting point. I know some people say it's canon. Gene Roddenberry said it's not canon, and then he like took parts of it and then treated it like canon. So it's kind of, it's that's a real gray area. But I think the novels are really not considered canon, according to anyone who ever worked on any show.
All right, we'll go on that premise then. Well, then the fact that I said that Spock, does or Vulcans in general don't have sweat glands. Well, that may be a Fanon thing then.
Mm. I will say that I noticed that in the show he really doesn't sweat as much as the other actors. And I think that's like, it's not because it's not because Leonard Nimoy didn't actually sweat. It's probably just a makeup thing, maybe.
But where I was going with Spock was it just makes sense, that, a
Mm.
race who lives in the desert needs to have a lower body temperature, whether or not, they actually have sweat glands, right? We'll just put that
Yeah.
fact aside. But
Yeah.
they need to have a lower body temperature just in order to survive in the environment. It's natural then to assume that someone with a lower body temperature is sensitive to cold, right? More susceptible to cold. And I think it was mentioned Vulcan elders are far more susceptible to cold, which makes sense because even, humans at a older age get that way,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
I was never very sure where the Spock having hot skin or having a higher body temperature than humans came from, because it's just contradictory to the nature of a race that comes from a desert environment.
I will say that I don't think I've read a lot of fan fiction where Spock has a very, like, a hotter skin than normal humans. I did, however, read a lot of fan fiction where Spock is very, very sensitive to cold, which the show contradicts, like, outright.
This is the interesting thing, Soda. I didn't start reading this Spock being hot temperature, higher temperatured, having hot skin until AOS reboot fan
Mm,
fiction.
okay.
So I don't, which is just crazy because, like you, when I read original series fan fiction and when I write it personally, it's with canon. It's with him having lower
Mhm.
body temperature and potentially being, more susceptible to cold, which is why it completely threw me off when I would read reboot Spock being
Mhm.
opposite of that.
It's that's interesting, but like I said, I think I said it in the previous podcast. I didn't watch the new movies,
Yeah.
so I don't know where that came. It might, I don't know. Maybe one day I will see them and then I'll find out where it came from. Maybe it's
Or maybe someone who's
common
listening to the podcast can
to
chime
us.
in with a where this Fanon fact came from.
Maybe, but where did the fanon that Spock is very sensitive to cold came from?
I think that was a natural development of the fact that he has a lower body temperature.
Like, I get it, but the series itself contradicts it because every time we see the characters in a environment that's very cold, Spock is always the least sensitive to it.
Somehow, I always took that with a grain of salt because I think Spock in the original series was supposed to be portrayed as being rarely affected by anything externally. And he certainly didn't make a point of showing if he was affected by something. If you remember Breads and Circuses episode,
Yeah,
when he's, quote, testing the bars, but he's been testing the bars, a dozen times over to see if he can break out of the jail,
yeah,
he doesn't appear to be anxious, right? But McCoy calls him out on it.
Yeah, but I always took it as like he's supposed to be like unaffected by emotional things because he's a Vulcan, not by environmental things. I mean, there's nothing illogical about being cold. It's
No,
just
there's
the
not.
environment.
But they gave him almost like superhuman characteristics. So super hearing, super strength.
I think that's the thing. That the Vulcans may have lower body temperatures, but they're also like extremely durable. Maybe there's like a thing where their skin is extra thick, so they aren't as affected by the environment as humans. So it would make sense that they're not as sensitive to cold, even though they have lower body temperatures.
They have thick reptilian skin.
And they might have, we don't know.
That would definitely be a fanon because I'm pretty sure I've never read a canon like that. Yeah, I totally agree with your point. I'm going with this from the perspective that it's very convenient for Spock to be sensitive to cold in a story,
Mm,
especially when it's a slash story.
yeah, of course.
So that's where I think that fanon part of it came from. That's why it's more popular, I think. I would say him being hot natured. If we had to compare just the two fanon.
No, I totally get it because I remember when I watched the first season of the original series, and then started the second season, and they saw a mock time, and I was really surprised by the way they portrayed Vulcan, the planet, because I did not think it was a desert planet. It somehow never occurred to me that it could be a desert planet. It doesn't look like someone from a desert planet. It doesn't act like someone you would stereotypically think comes from a desert planet. You imagine someone from a hot planet being hot-blooded and emotional, but he's not like that at all.
Well, I might argue that Romulans are kind of hot tempered and emotional. And supposedly they originate from the same race.
Yeah, that's actually why I'm watching the Next Generation now, and I'm kind of mad that they make the Romulans and the Vulcans more different than they were in the original series, because I thought it was interesting. They're essentially the same people, but they're completely different in their mentality.
Ideologies.
Yeah,
Well, I don't know that we can come to a consensus on this, but
we can come
um,
to a consensus. It's very comfortable for slash fanfiction writers to have Spock be cold, and for
and need some
Kirk or
cuddles, right?
McCoy, yeah, and be forced into cuddles despite the fact he doesn't want them, or despite the fact he says he doesn't want them.
I guess by that token, perhaps it came up in the reboot fanfiction that Spock is hot natured, literally, because that would mean that he could walk around in little clothing.
That could be true, yeah.
He could actually, say, cuddle like a Kirk or a McCoy in a cold environment because he has a higher body temperature. That's just what we call a plot device.
It's a very Fanon common plot
Yeah,
device, yeah.
absolutely. I think we should move on to maybe the next one.
Should we still finish talking about Spock's characteristics, or should we switch a character?
I think as far as character traits and personality and the physical attributes, that's it. Unless you
Okay.
want to talk about, you want to skip one and maybe talk about the mind melding
Uh,
or
let's move on.
the touch telepathy maybe.
Okay. Yeah, the touch telepathy. So, um, the Vulcan kiss. Let's start with that. The name itself, the Vulcan kiss, didn't come from any series or movie, as far as I know. I think it was actually coined by one of Leonard Nimoy's biographies. It's either I am Spock or I'm not Spock. One of those.
Let me ask you about the original series episode, the Enterprise incident.
Yeah.
So this is the one where Spock meets a Romulan female officer, and at one point they're having I will say a seduction is ongoing.
I would call it a finger makeout, but okay.
Yeah, a finger make out. So,
Yeah.
do you remember specifically if the finger making out was called that in the, or Was it
I don't
just they were
think
doing something weird with their fingers together, and at the time nobody actually said it was a Vulcan kiss?
no, I don't think they ever called it anything. They just did it, and it was like this weird alien thing that they do, because they can.
And because they have sensitive fingers that go along with touch telepathy.
That's the thing. How sensitive the fingers are, I see, varies very, very greatly in Fanon than it is in Canon.
Absolutely. There are instances where even in the original series that say, I can't remember the episode name, it's eluding me for a second, but where they meet the, what is it, the Kelvins? The race from beyond the Great Barrier, and they're stuck in this sort of cave prison, and Spock is supposed to reach the mind of the guard outside the prison,
And
and he's touching the
it works.
wall. He's touching the wall, and he's somehow influencing the guard to let them out through a rock wall. So he's not physically touching anyone. So to your point, how sensitive and how involved is having touch in the actual telepathy. I don't know, because it seems to me the original series contradicted itself on that.
I remember also the episode of the the one where the planet is having a war with another planet through a computer, and they put Jim and Spock and other people in a jail cell, and Spock somehow manages to telepathically influence the guard outside of the jail cell without touching him too.
Yes, yet in the one like Dagger of the Mind, where you have the escaped prisoner who's like crazy. He's been made crazy from this mind machine or whatever.
Yeah.
Spock has to touch him to connect to his mind to basically figure out the depth of his insanity.
I think that's the first time he ever actually did that. That's the first time they were ever mentioned that he has telepathic powers. I think people took that as canon and kind of ignored those other two instances because they were kind of stupid. They were kind of plot convenience instances. They weren't very explained, and they were kind of ignored afterwards.
Yeah.
But I think what I mean is, like, when Fanon declared the finger touch as a kiss, then they seem to have also made the Vulcan hands a very, very sensitive part of their body, which is not the same in the series. I don't think they ever said it's anything like that in the series. Like, you see people think that the Vulcans see something lewd about hands or something like that.
The Western episode where they Spectre of the Gun.
Yeah.
He has to help them all convince themselves that it's not real.
Yeah.
So that they don't die by gunshot wounds. It seems to me that they wanted him to have this telepathic ability, but even the writers themselves were not clear on what the rules were to go along with that. And I guess that's where the fans came in and said, hey, this is a pretty cool ability, but since I'm a Slash fan, I could really make use of this one.
Obviously.
What's more intimate than an erogenous zone in the fingers and the ability to connect two minds?
Yeah, and then there's also, the first movie, the
Viger movie. Yeah, it's the motion picture.
The motion picture. At the beginning, when Spock is on Gaul and he gets this, this message, this telepathic message, and he can't complete his, training to be a monk or whatever.
His Colinar experience to purge all emotion.
So that's the interesting thing. The novelization of the motion picture is the only Star Trek novel that's written by Gene Roddenberry. So a lot of fans kind of take it as a canon as much as their movies and the show itself. And in the novelization, you probably heard this. In the movie, it looks like he gets this telepathic message from V'ger. But in the novelization, he actually gets a telepathic message from Kirk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's some yeah, there's some plot discrepancy there.
Yeah. I don't know if it's really a plot discrepancy because the movie doesn't make it very clear. It just, it intercuts shots of Spock, being in the Kolinar, and then a shot of V'ger, and it's like, oh, so that's where he got it from. But the novel's like, no, he couldn't complete it because he couldn't stop thinking about Kirk, and he got a telepathic message from Kirk. So, a lot of fans get very crazy about theories about mind links and interplanetary mind links and how strong the Vulcan bond is, you know.
And why he would even be more bonded with Kirk, because why? Is it because he has more mind melds with Kirk in the original series? I don't know that.
No one knows that. No one
No one knows
knows.
that. So why would he be closer to Kirk than, say, anyone else? Even his biological father, right?
Yeah.
Why? I don't know.
So yeah, I think fans got very, very excited by that, slash fans specifically. And I think a lot of people now, there are a lot of theories about how Vulcan marriages, if you read fan fiction about when Spock marries Kirk or something like that, a lot of them include some kind of ceremony to link their minds or something like that.
Yes. Yes, it
It,
is very popular. I would say so much so that people care less about what is canon and more about just the fanon accepted perception of Vulcan kisses with the fingers and mind links and being able to mind meld and have that intimate connection with your significant other. I don't even know that you could pose a sufficient argument based on canon that would ever change anyone's mind. It's that well accepted. It's that well accepted and that romanticized that you just could never. I think it's such an intrinsic part now of just the way people think about Spock functioning as a telepath.
yeah, I don't think I've ever read a fan fiction of Spock being in a relationship, with either Kirk or McCoy or both of them, where there wasn't this component of him having some presence in their mind, some mental link with them somehow.
Yes, it seems to be assumed that for his own mental well being, if he has a partner, they need to be linked
Yeah.
mentally or telepathically or whatever you want to call it. Gives a lot of advantage to fanfic writers, though, because you could make all kinds of situations where, oh, the link is damaged or it's in jeopardy, or they have to link their minds to survive a situation, but then they can't undo it. I mean,
Yeah.
aliens made them do it. Other aliens. Yeah.
Accidental marriage, mental link style. Yeah.
Yeah. I did it to save your life, but now we are technically married by the laws of my culture.
Yeah.
What? Yeah. This is a good one. I think as opposed to what we were just talking about with the difference in skin temperature, which just is kind of logical, just the canon part of it. I think this one is interesting because it veers more towards Fanon being far more popular than the fact that there's really no canon around it.
Yeah.
But I'm definitely not a naysayer on this one because I'm a romantic myself. I like it.
It's a fun trope. Yeah.
And it's different than, say, the way a betazoid would work, right? Because they don't have to touch anybody.
Yeah. The Betazoid are completely telepathic, unlimited telepathy.
Oh, and I did want to mention one thing here since we're on the subject. Spock is, well, he's supposed to be different because he's a hybrid between a Vulcan and a human, and yet Fanon sort of portrays him as one of the strongest telepaths in the Vulcan race.
Yeah, that's also interesting. I think physiologically he he is more Vulcan than he's human. I think it was kind of made clear in the series itself.
Yeah, it was. I actually believe that's canon that he was supposed to be physiologically more Vulcan than human.
So I don't think it would because we don't know how the telepathy things works exactly. We don't know if it's like if it how affected it is by biology. So maybe the human components in his body do make him stronger as a telepath. Who knows? We don't know.
Which is would be funny as heck because he's always, comparing himself to those psi null humans.
Well, in Discovery, it's interesting. I can mention Discovery, right?
Yeah.
In Discovery, even the first episode, actually, we see Sarek having a telepathic connection with a human light years away. So
Yes.
maybe if Sarek is one of the strongest telepaths among Vulcans, and Spock maybe inherited this ability. We don't know. It's possible.
Well, I have to say, for someone who can change someone's mind through a rock wall, he must be pretty strong.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
I will say, I think in Discovery, the fact that you're mentioning the scene with Sarek actually reaches out to Michael,
Yeah.
and they're light years apart, right?
Yeah.
I think that was based off of the fact that he saved her life.
Yeah, it's also true that he has like this component of himself inside of her because he saved his life or something.
Right, and so I took that to mean that that was why he had such a strong connection with her.
It's possible, but I still think that like she's still light years apart. If usually Vulcans can't even form a telepathic connection without touching someone, so that's still
It's
pretty
far
impressive.
fetched. It's far fetched
Yeah.
because I didn't believe it when I saw it. To be honest, I was of your opinion where it's wow, this is either the strongest Vulcan ever, or he's literally like put a piece of his soul inside of her, and it's like Kirk reaching out to Spock while he's in the middle of his right on Vulcan
Yeah.
in the V'ger movie. How does that even work? I don't know.
Yeah. So yeah, the Vulcan telepathy thing is really unexplained in the canon. That's what we can come to a conclusion that aside if the body temperature thing is actually explained and Fen kind of ignores it. In the telepathy things, it's more like Fanon invents his own stuff because the canon is kind of unclear.
Fans definitely ran away with that one.
Yeah.
They just they went the long mile and
Yeah.
filled in all the blanks and made it super special. So much so that it's one of the first things you learn when you come into the fandom if you're in any way interested, even if you're just interested in platonic relationships, guarantee you there's going to be some strong themes of Spock being this really skilled telepath and saving the day with his abilities
Yeah.
through a mind link with somebody.
Yeah.
That said, I think we can move away from Spock on this one, and let's just touch on the last one with Jim.
Yeah. Isn't it interesting though that Spock is basically the one that we know the most about, but he's still one of those that we have the most fanon about on top of that?
It's because he's
Popular.
so popular.
Yeah.
He was popular, he became unprecedentedly popular when they aired the original series, and I don't think his popularity has suffered since. It's just continues to grow.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people see themselves in his characterization because he is sort of an outsider, for the fact that he's not really a human, and he may seem completely Vulcan, but he's not either. That speaks to a lot of people and feeling that they're not quite average like everybody else, or
Yeah,
just
doesn't really
on
belong.
emotional level. I think the way that he is written, that's what contributes to his popularity.
Yeah, I can see that, but you just
Mm-hmm.
found it interesting, that's all.
And or people either just thought he was super interesting and just wanted to fill in all the blanks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's move on to Jim.
Yeah, let's move on to Kirk. I have very deep feelings about this subject.
Okay, before we start with the heavy subjects, I just want to note another thing that I didn't write here. The matter of Kirk's family. So he mentions his mother in a deleted scene, I think. When there was this episode where his brother dies and his nephew stays alive, and there's a deleted scene where he offers the nephew like to go to his mother or something like that.
You mean in Operation Annihilate?
Yeah.
Yeah, the Geneva episode where he plays his own brother.
Yeah.
Bill Shatner plays his own brother. Yeah.
Yeah.
With a mustache.
He plays the body of his own brother, but yeah. So a lot of people took it to mean that his father is dead, even though this was never confirmed in the series. I see it in Fanon all the time that his father is dead. And I know that in the new movies his father is dead, he even died a long time ago, so, you know, that's
This is
why
an
they even
interesting
edited
one.
it.
A very interesting one for you to bring up because in canon, original series canon,
Mm-hmm.
besides what we see in maybe Operation Annihilate, you don't really know anything else about Kirk's family. I think all the backstory was filled in through the novelizations. And it's not even canon right at that point, right? To your point, it's Fanon. So, but I think if you go on like Memory Alpha, you would see where it talks about his father being alive. His father's retired from Starfleet, and I assumed that his father was alive, his mother was alive, and if in fact they did take in his nephew.
I think he mentions his brother in another episode, in the one where they're in the cave with the guy that Chapel is engaged to. So he mentions his brother there too, but the interesting thing is that in that episode he says that his brother had 3 children, not just one. But the point about the father, I'm not so sure that I'll find it in Memory Alpha, because maybe when it comes to the new movies, I don't know when his father is dead in the new movies. But he really never mentions his father in the original series or any of the original movies. So if it's there, it's only from the novels.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I agree. There, like I said, there's no background from Kirk in canon.
But
If
I
we're
see it in
saying,
fan fiction all the time, even in original series fan fiction, that his father is dead. Everybody is convinced that his father is dead.
I've never seen it in original fan fiction, just because I never see people addressing his family. I mean, it's a huge theme in Reboot. Let me tell you, this is supposedly what makes Kirk kind of a loose cannon, right? His the instability of his family that all derives from this one incident called the Narada incident, where his father sacrifices himself. He grows up without a father, and they don't focus on that very much. It's sort of implied that not having his father, and we're not at that point in the movie, we're not really sure, whether he had his mother around that much. And we do see at one point where his brother may just be leaving the family situation at a young age. But that's what really drives Kirk to be unstable himself at the point at which he is about to embark on the journey to Starfleet Academy. So it's part of who he is, so much so that it's made him reckless. And people just really latched on to that from the reboot movies.
It's possible. I did read a few fan fiction from the original series that does talk a little bit about Jim's family, and they always mention that his father is dead, which is kind of weird. I will say that I know the general story of Kirk's father in the reboot movies. I don't really like it. Like, no shame to anyone who does. I just find it a little bit cliche. And I think I find that I like the original series Kirk more, because it's not like his destiny. He's destined to follow in his father's footsteps. He really took inspiration from his father. I really like that it's like he doesn't go that route. That's just who he is. He's that guy. He just
Yeah,
that's what he does, and so he does it.
I prefer the idea that original series Kirk is so strong of a character, with firm compass of morality, and because he grew up in a stable family environment. He is so well put together. And even though, yeah, okay, he does occasionally like to do some reckless things, but he has a strong sense of
Yeah.
responsibility. And to me, that speaks of someone who was raised in a stable environment or had at least some stable support as they were growing up.
It makes more sense, that he got to the position that he got into, which is a very good position. Like, he's the captain of the flagship of Starfleet, and it makes sense that he would be like this responsible guy with a very strong moral backbone. That he
Mm-hmm.
doesn't just shoot from the hip. He knows what he's about. He knows what to do. It makes sense. That's why he's one of the best captains in Starfleet, because he is that guy.
We could do like a nature versus nurture argument, and whether or not that takes away from who he is, having or not having a family. But I find it interesting that you brought that up because I have not seen any fan fiction, at least on the original series side, where his father's dead, and if his father's dead, if that makes any difference.
Usually, even in those stories, like, he died when Kirk was old. Like, no, he didn't die when Kirk was young. But it's
Mm-hmm.
still like, yeah, his father is just dead all the time in every fanfic. His father is dead.
Well, you will always see it pretty much in the reboot fanfiction because his father is dead, and apparently that is a very emotional subject and potentially makes him unstable. So if you like your melodrama, that is the reboot fanfiction is for you.
Okay, but let's talk about the meat of the subject.
Oh, yes. So I'm going to start with the hard one,
Yeah.
which is why Jim Kirk is portrayed as a womanizer.
Mm-hmm.
I want to talk about the reboot series first because I just want to get that out of the way. This is where all my heartburn is, okay?
Yeah.
It's because he is portrayed as a womanizer in the reboot movies, at least the first two. And I don't think that that was well thought out.
Mm-hmm.
There's a large number of fans who believe it was just the result of the writers wanting to do an action movie for, you know, the typical male audience. And so, of course, they made Jim Kirk have scenes where he's, oogling women or he's in bed with women or something like that. And it actually infuriated a lot of people
Yeah.
because those who are original series fans know that Jim Kirk stands up for the woman, okay? There's the one thing that sticks out in my mind is that episode where, what is it, Tomorrow is Yesterday?
Which one?
The one where the pilot comes from the past,
Oh, right.
right?
Yeah.
And he's on the Enterprise and he's following Kirk to the quarters. The pilot, who's your typical male from the 60s, looks at a woman and goes, "A woman? Like a woman on a military ship or whatever it is he thought he was on." Kirk looks at him and goes, "A crewman." It's just he just says that automatically, like, no, the fact that she's female is irrelevant. I don't know. That stuck with me.
There's that, but there's also that episode with the shore leave when he and McCoy are talking about this yeoman, and they're like, "Oh, in a few years she'll find a husband and quit her job or something like that." Um, it was the '60s. You can't divorce the series from the '60s, and
I agree. You can't divorce a series from the 60s, but you can see that it made an effort
it
to be
made an effort.
progressive.
Yeah, it made an effort. Well, I won't start about the next generation. This isn't the time or place, but it did make a very big effort um, compared to other series from the '60s. And I think it's interesting when I showed a friend of mine who's never she watched the Next Generation. She never seen. I think I told you she never seen the original series before. She saw the new movies. So I showed her a few episodes of the original series, and like she was a little uncomfortable with the way women were portrayed. because it was still very 60s, not because there was really outright sexism, but it was still a very 60s way of looking at female characters. Like, they often do use the sexuality a lot. They are often the love interest, the designated love interest, even if there isn't really a romance story there. And the way that the men do speak to them is kind of patronizing a lot of the time, but they still, in Kirk's case, they really did make a lot of effort to make him like this ultra modern man who is very, very pro women.
Yes. A lot of original Star Trek fans watched the reboot movies and went, "What? Why does he look like he has no respect for women?"
Yeah, but it's interesting because they probably made this because the general public does view Kirk as kind of a womanizer.
It's almost kind of comical, right? In what people know about Star Trek, and when they don't actually know about Star Trek because they don't actually watch the series, yet they know about Spock and they know about Kirk. Having a close relationship, they know Spock's got the pointed ears, and they seem to know Kirk is a womanizer, but that's not really true. It just comes from the fact that every other episode, Kirk is with a woman.
Yeah.
For some reason.
Yeah.
He's charming a woman, so I think they took that to mean that he's a womanizer, but that's not actually, I don't think that's actually the case.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because today's fandom, I think, is a lot more pro-feminist Kirk than womanizer Kirk.
When I was actually writing this topic out, I had a moment where I thought, is this Fanon or is this Canon?
Yeah.
You've got Canon, portraying Kirk in a not, especially in the reboot movies, like I said, he's not portrayed in the best light. And of course, you have all those scenes and whatnot where he's, embracing a woman in the original series. But then on the same token, you have scenes in the original series where he clearly shows his respect for women. So I don't necessarily equate him being charming with him being a womanizer. I think they went a little over that line, though, in the rebooted movies.
I will say that there's a general perception in society that anyone who has a lot of sexual partners, any man who has a lot of female sexual partners is kind of, a player. He's using them. He's not, I don't agree with that, but you can have a lot of sexual partners and not be like an ass about it. You can be a feminist and sleep with a lot of women. It's not like a contradiction. You just have to be respectful. And Kirk is very
absolutely
respectful.
Which is why I don't really marry the two in my mind. I mean, to be honest, if Kirk's got a partner, it's the Enterprise.
Yeah. Well, he did sacrifice it for Spock, but okay.
I mean, true, but I think in a lot of episodes he's really more portrayed as someone who is lonely. Not necessarily lonely, but he takes his responsibility very seriously, and he doesn't necessarily
he's married to his job.
Allow him. He's married to his job, and he doesn't necessarily allow himself to be as open with his subordinates, because there could be that misconception that he's abusing his power, and I think he's very conscious of that.
Yeah. Again, there is like an episode of The Next Generation that I just saw that is very, very different from that, and not in a good way. But I think the point here is that he, not just that he doesn't want to appear like he's using his powers, he also doesn't seem to want to like lead his partners on. Like, he can't have a girlfriend and then he let her think that one day he might retire and they could marry and live in a stable house. This is his job. This is his life. He's not going to give it up anytime soon.
Yeah. I guess I'll bring it up, but, the whole situation with Carol, right? And the fact that she has a son with him that he never really knows, because of the fact that they were both too ambitious to stay together even before he became a captain.
Yeah, and that's interesting. Like, I see a lot of people point this out, that, she wanted custody of the son and she didn't want him to know who his father is, and Kirk respected her wishes. So that makes him a feminist. And I'm like, you know what? That's not really the point, because I don't think he would have been less feminist if he would have demanded, have like a relationship with his son. It's not like anti-feminist to want that, but
I've never heard that argument. That's interesting because I don't get it either.
I've seen this argument so many times, like, and it's really baffling because there's nothing anti-feminist about wanting a connection with your son, but at the same time, like, yeah, he did realize that he recognized that there is a problem here and he stepped down. And whether you agree with this decision or not, it just shows that, yeah, he's really, really ambitious. He's really married to his job.
Mm-hmm. I think if we can agree on one thing, it's that the original series Kirk is portrayed as a mature adult. And there have been some instances where it seems that the Jim Kirk of the rebooted movies is, at least in the first movie, not that mature adult quite yet. But there's the potential. Whether we think he's a womanizer or we think he's a feminist, at least we can agree that he's. I don't think he leans necessarily one way or the other.
Yeah, I think, well, the original series, I think he does lean more toward the feminist, but like the feminist of the 60s. Feminism as it was back then. It might not always gel with today's feminism because, times have changed, but it's important to recognize the effort they made. And there was apparently no effort in the new movies.
I don't want to get too much into disparaging the producers and the director and the writers, but they have to take some blame for that,
Yeah.
for sure. I will say that Star Trek Beyond, the third movie, made a course correction. So, good for them for recognizing their problems in the way that they were portraying their main character and trying to rectify that.
Yeah.
Since we've talked about Spock and we've talked about Kirk, do you want to talk about McCoy?
Let's talk about McCoy. McCoy's problem is that in neither the new movies or the old series or the old movies, no one knows anything about his backstory. It's never mentioned. No one ever talks about it. He never mentions it. Well, there was this one time in the animated series where he kind of mentioned he has a daughter, but he never mentioned how he came about to having a daughter and how old is she and where is she. So McCoy is a complete blank slate, and the Fanon just kind of took bits and pieces from novels and like production notes and compiled a backstory for him.
There's so much here. Wow, we could spend an hour on this subject. I have read the ongoing rebooted comics.
Yeah.
And McCoy is, in that fashion at least, supplied some backstory as far as his marriage, his failed marriage. Because in the first rebooted movie, he shows up on the shuttle, leaving Riverside, going to the Starfleet Academy for being recruited to go to the academy, and that's when you learn that he's gone through a divorce, apparently not an easy divorce because he's perpetually drunk. And
Okay.
yeah, and that's where he meets Kirk, but they don't really touch on that subject again. However, in the comic series that came out after that first movie, which was to expand on the backstory of everyone, they actually had a series of comics just in that where each character got a little backstory. So McCoy's was that, he was married to a woman named Pamela, which is interesting because I think Fanon calls her Jocelyn.
I think it's from a novel. The name Jocelyn.
It is from a novel. Can't recall the title right now, but yes, there's a whole novel that gives him a backstory with his wife and everything. But in the comic, her name's Pamela, and all it really shows is that they're both very busy with their jobs and that they become estranged in their marriage. And, due to the pressure of their jobs and the fact that they have different schedules and they don't see each other, it's literally shown that like they will sleep in the bed at the same time with their backs to each other. So they just lost communication, became estranged, and ended up being divorced. So it didn't necessarily portray it as a nasty divorce, even though, like I said, he's a drunk when he shows up on the shuttle. It's just that maybe they married too young, or at a time in their lives when they didn't have enough to a functional relationship going. So I think the communication must have broken down, and then they ended up divorced. So that's all you get on the rebooted movie side. And like you said, there's literally nothing in the original series canon about his backstory. And then we have TAS, which we don't even know if we're counting it or not.
Yeah.
But let me ask you a question about TAS. That episode where they say he has a daughter named Joanna. She shows up in that episode, right? She doesn't. Why is it that I'm under the impression that he was afraid that Kirk would charm his daughter?
No, there was a scrapped episode. They planned to do an episode in the original series. The space hippie episode. You remember that one? The one with the space hippies? They wanted originally to have the main space hippie chick be McCoy's daughter, not a friend of Chekhov. And they wanted Kirk to hit on her. And they decided that, no, they better go with like a friend of Chekhov instead. I am very thankful that they went this route, because otherwise it would have made a bad episode like 10 times worse. And I kind of loved this episode for how campy and stupid it is. But it would have made the episode like legitimately bad. To have Kirk hit on very young women for no reason.
Well, I hate to say it, but they might have done it in an original series comic. Because I have literally seen a scene, and I can't remember if it was the animated series or in a comic, where McCoy is fussing at Kirk because he thinks Kirk has charmed his daughter.
It's not the animated series.
His adult daughter. Well, then it's a comic. So, and I guess they did it anyway.
Yeah. No, in the animated series, he only mentions that she went to some school that some rich guy donated something to. I don't know. She's literally just mentioned in this one line that's it.
Is it mentioned anywhere in the original series that he's divorced?
No.
No, I didn't think so. I couldn't recall anything about that.
It was in the production notes, though. It was in the production notes, but they didn't set it on screen.
So we have in the original series that it's never specifically said that he's divorced, but there is some evidence that he has a child.
Yeah.
And in the rebooted series, it's specifically stated that he is divorced, but there's no evidence whatsoever that they ever had a child together. Interesting. It's backwards.
Yeah. Well, I think it's because the McCoy in the series is old. He's older. He's like, I don't know how older he's supposed to be than the reboot series McCoy.
Well, technically, they're supposed to be of the same age. It's just that in the rebooted movies, they get together as a crew much earlier than they do when they're a crew in the original series.
How earlier?
Kirk becomes captain when he's 24, and McCoy's 27.
So 10 years earlier.
Yeah.
Okay. No, I think it makes sense, because if you had a kid at that age, she would be a very young child. I think it's more or less hinted in the animated series that she's at least older than a teenager. There is a difference between seeing the character, implying that the character has left his like adult child to do her thing, and a character leaving the planet when he has like a 6-year-old back at home.
Right, but here's where we get into the Fanon.
Oh yeah.
Okay, because everybody loves McCoy having a daughter.
Of course.
And in the rebooted, the AOS, they love the fact that he has a young daughter that he's left behind, that either he has not seen in a long time, has trouble reconnecting with, or that he just misses terribly. So it's an emotional plot device in all the fanfics that I read.
Of course.
I have to say, I see it a little less on the original series side, but I think since the rebooted movies came out, it seems to have been more prevalent than what I used to read in the original series fanfiction.
In most original series fanfiction that I read where he had a daughter, she was usually an adult already. Which would
Yes.
make sense. He's like, well, depends on when the fanfiction takes place, but he can be anywhere between like 40 and 60. Or even older, because we know he lived to 137 at least. So, she's already an adult, and they usually have a more complex relationship than just, a little girl that's missing her dad.
While it's popular, I think that, he may have this daughter that he's not in touch with. He may be estranged from, that he wishes to have a close relationship, or that he does have a close relationship and keeps in communication with often. It's almost always portrayed in Fanon, the mother of the daughter is someone he does not have a good relationship with. And that I find very interesting.
That's true.
I don't know if that's for melodramatic reasons. I suspect that it is.
I think it's because in the production notes that I mentioned, it was mentioned that he's divorced, and the divorce, it wasn't a very easy divorce either, like in the original series. So it would make sense, if you have a bitter divorce with someone, you probably don't have a very good relationship with them.
But I'll argue, what divorce is easy? So I don't know. I'm kind of a mind that we don't have any evidence to support on either side that he went through a bitter divorce. Now, he may feel bitter because he's divorced. But I don't know that I've ever seen any evidence to substantiate that he feels bitter towards his ex.
Well, no, because we don't have even any evidence that he has an ex, so
Well, yeah. Except in the rebooted movies, he does have an ex.
In the rebooted movies, it's a different story. But in the original series and movies, we don't even have. For all we know, we could have like a backstory, because they never mentioned it on screen. It could have like a backstory that he has a daughter from a situation that's similar to Kirk's. Like, he never actually married the woman; he just had a child with her, and they went their separate ways somehow. Who knows?
That's why I put in these notes. Nobody really knows. Everything is speculation when it comes to McCoy's background.
The thing is, I never saw it in fanfiction. I never saw a fanfiction that had these stakes, so, it's interesting.
I think that people like McCoy so much, they want to give him an origin story. And I believe that's why we even have novelizations, like whole novelizations, that focus just on who he was before he was Dr. McCoy of the Starship Enterprise. Not only is it because it's so mysterious, but people just like him as a character and want to know more about him and give him a bigger role than, say, he had in the original series, and gosh knows that he had in the rebooted movies. I can't blame him for that.
Yeah, when there is nothing, the Fanon comes with something.
That's exactly right. That is our job as a fan, is to help the material live on. And if there is no material, just make it up.
Yeah, basically.
So is there anything else you want to talk about before we move on from McCoy?
No, nothing in particular.
Can we really quickly talk about the ring that he wears?
Yeah. Okay, yeah. There are a lot of speculations about that, yeah.
So it is canon that he wears a ring. It's canon in both the original series and the rebooted movies.
I didn't know that. Okay.
Carl Urban wanted to do tribute to DeForest Kelley, made sure that he wore a ring on his pinky for the rebooted movies. However, there's no backstory. And I believe this is where fandom has rallied and provided the most interesting backstories about that ring.
That's interesting because I've read several backstories for that ring. There isn't actually a unified Fanon, like one theory almost everyone get behind. Everyone has their own theory about what it means.
No, all they get behind is the fact that it's probably important to McCoy, and it might be part of his heritage, and that's it.
Well, some say it's a reminder of his marriage, of his failed marriage.
I more often see the heritage argument that it's, from his mother, from his grandmother. It's all over the board, like you said, but people like to call it out for some reason. It's funny how people notice even the smallest details about characters. even if they're on screen for less than an hour. And then they write whole
Well,
stories for it.
when you rewatch like the same 70 episodes, for 40 decades, you start noticing those things.
Well, I think that's all I had about McCoy.
Yeah, I don't have any other interesting Fanon things about him. Do you want to move on?
I do. Let's talk about Fanon that is more popular than Canon. We have 2 bullet points here, which I think kind of go hand in hand, but I'm going to let you kick us off on the first one.
Okay, so we are saving the most interesting part for last. Okay, so let's start with those two. Leonard Nimoy was Jewish. William Shatner was Jewish, and Chris Pine is Jewish. And Leonard Nimoy, unlike William Shatner, was a lot more vocal about his Jewish heritage. And so a lot of and of course, the woman that played Amanda Grayson in the reboot movies, I forgot her name. Yeah, she's
Winona
also
Ryder.
Jewish. So a lot of people just came up with the idea that Spock's mother is Jewish and that Kirk is also Jewish. And it's very popular in Fanon, even though it has absolutely zero evidence in any series or movie that I know of.
This is one where let Fanon do whatever the heck it wants. Because probably one of the more important things about being part of a fandom is feeling like you're represented. And I think that the fact that they say give a Jewish heritage to characters where there is no canon material to support that goes along with the idea that, or fans who are Jewish feel better represented, that these characters are like them or come from the same background that they do or have the same ideals and values that they do. So I don't necessarily see an argument here, what is canon, what is Fanon. I just know that Fanon is far more popular on this and, more power to
I
him.
think the interesting part here is that human religion is hardly ever mentioned in the series or movies. Like we know a lot about Vulcan spirituality, but we don't know a lot about what humans believe, in the 21st century. It's interesting because Gene Roddenberry himself was a very staunch atheist. He well, the series was recorded in the 60s, so they did mention God a lot of times because, it was kind of part of the time that, people were a more religious, had a more religious mindset, but he was more of like, I don't know, he was more of an atheist.
Well, what about bread and circuses and the whole sun thing?
I know.
I mean, that was a very Christian episode.
Well, I mean, it had a very Christian ending. I don't know. The rest of the episode didn't really touch on that, but okay.
No, it didn't, but it was leading up to that.
I think it was kind of a cute twist. They were talking about the sun, but then it's like, it's not the sun, it's the sun. Okay.
Well, that's something I like about Star Trek, though, is it doesn't push ideologies except for the ideology that all peoples are better off united, stronger together. That's really, one of the main tenets of Star Trek. Besides that, we embrace diversity, whether it's diversity in gender, in race, in religion, in politics. Irrelevant to being unified and looking out for each other.
We don't have to give up the differences between us to be united.
A great way to put it. But that said, it totally doesn't surprise me because we don't have canon material for people, for character backgrounds or heritages or what specifically matters to a character, that fanons come in and supply that, if you will. And that they may lean towards one or the other just based on who the actor was.
Exactly. And I find it interesting because a lot of time, for example, especially in Spurk kind of material, they use it as a way for them to bond over this one thing they have in common.
That makes sense because people do bond and start romantic relationships over things like religion or common religious beliefs.
Or even just I think most fans do understand that Spock is religiously is more he adheres to the Vulcan sets of beliefs, but maybe like he
Hmm.
takes part in a cultural way in his Jewish heritage.
It's kind of funny that there's a lot of emphasis placed on, let's say, Jewish heritage, Jewish background. It made me think about Christian heritage, Christian background, and
Mm,
Christmas. So you're gonna laugh because I've seen a lot of
yeah,
Christmas themed stories where everybody's celebrating this holiday, and today that holiday may be very popular even around the
yeah,
world, right? We have many different countries who celebrate Christmas, even though maybe they're not originally of a Christian faith. They just celebrate it because it's a kind of like a international holiday almost. It's about giving and this, that, and the other. Some people put more religious focus on it than others. But whenever I read a story, a Trek fandom about Christmas, my first question in my mind is, does Christmas still exist in the
it's
23rd
interesting.
century?
I think that there is one of the early episodes mentions Thanksgiving, and that's also kind of like is 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 America still a
What?
thing? Like the country? Is Thanksgiving still a thing in the 21st century? Like
Like you said, it's a 60s show, has a lot of
yeah,
60s ideals, but it's also a 60s show in the United States, and therefore has a lot of American ideals put into it and American tradition. And so it totally does not surprise me that, there's a mention of Thanksgiving and that people write stories about the crew celebrating
oh,
Christmas
The
and
Christmas was mentioned in the series. In the episode "The Dagger of the Mind," actually, he's feeling awkward around this woman because he did something with her in the Christmas party. That's what they say.
that's right. They
Yeah.
had a Christmas party. And I remember thinking, even watching that episode, going, why? Like, why is that still around? Why? I guess I was wondering why call out that in particular. So the fact that they bring, like, say, those holidays into the series by mention, yet don't talk about others.
There is one episode that it doesn't exactly mention the origin, but there is one episode where this female officer who is Indian, it takes the place of either Sulu or Chekhov. I can't remember which. I think Sulu's place. And she has this the I think it's called the bindi. This I think it's like a Hindu symbol. I'm not sure if it's an Indian cultural symbol or a Hindu religious symbol. The dot on their forehead, Hindu. So
Hindu.
that's another kind of like covert message, I guess you can call it.
Mm-hmm. Now that I'm thinking about it, we were talking about how the show had made an effort to be progressive, and I think at the time you would have seen more diversity in that show, as you said, than any other show on television. In the rebooted movies, it's all over the board. It's, no two crewmen look alike. You have, the representation of races. You have a little bit of everybody, but they stay away from
Yeah.
the topic of religion, which I find very interesting. It seems to me that I read more fan fiction with the Fanon, like, the Fanon notion of having a Jewish heritage in rebooted fan fiction than I do in the original series.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I think the fans of the original series adhere more to this ideal of a far less religious world. I don't know how it goes in the reboot series, but religion really doesn't play much of a part in the original series fandom.
And I don't think it plays much of a part in the rebooted either. So it's interesting that because that matters to us in this day and age, we bring it in.
Well, Leonard Nimoy did talk a lot about how his Jewish heritage influenced the way he played Spock and how he influenced the build of the Vulcan mythos.
Oh, absolutely. He wrote a whole book on it. You're right, that plays a big part in why people actually argue whether or not
Yeah.
Spock is Jewish. So not just Amanda Grayson and Kirk and others, but especially when it comes to Spock himself.
And it's funny because I see a lot of people who are not really into the original series, and they look at the Vulcans, they're like, oh, they're like space Asians, and it's like, no, they're actually modeled after. They're not Nimoy's Jewish heritage, not Asian cultural things.
Maybe we could just say everybody sees a little bit of themselves in the Vulcans. I don't know. I think we could talk all day about how that part impacts what people like about Spock and Kirk and Amanda and how they think they interact.
I think we talked about it as much as we can talk about it. It's time we get to the last part, maybe. And I'll be honest, this is the part I wanted to talk about the most. I find it the most interesting.
Me too. That's why I was like, let's save the best for last. So our last topic here, concerning Fanon that's more popular than Canon, is attitudes towards homosexuality and polyamory. Where do you even get started on this one?
It's so interesting because it also changes.
Yes, it is, because you have holistically the original series being touted as the forefather of Slash, which is essentially fan fiction of homosexual relationships. Yet, in the original series, do you ever see a homosexual?
Not that I recall.
Me either.
The interesting thing is that I don't think they even ever met an alien species that isn't like divided between men and women, like a binary division.
Exactly, that isn't, just female, male.
I think even in one episode, like Kirk says that all species are divided like that, which doesn't make.
He says that? I don't remember that. Which episode?
The guy that invented the warp engine on the planet where this energy thing.
Cochrane episode. With
energy alien keeps him there,
yes.
And Kirk he recognizes the energy alien as a female, and the Cochrane says like, how can you even tell that? And he's like, it's all over the universe. Everyone is either female or female. That's all there is.
Well, I'm going to take that to mean that in his experience, he has come across so many humanoid races that they all seem to have female, male gender in common.
It's not even true on Earth. Like, there are species on Earth.
No, it's
not just male or female.
That's why I'm sitting here laughing to myself.
I think it was very obviously put in there because 60s. It's the 60s. It's the 60s standards. You can't put something that even implies something a little more racy than male-female relationship.
It seemed to be a requirement. The male characters in the show were very male, very, very straight sexuality. I just find that interesting because if you look at the way they're doing Discovery, right, in this day and age, you have so much more diversity in just sexuality than you ever had in the original series, because to your point, even the aliens supposedly were male-female couples. That's how they reproduced, which is crazy. Because I'm going to go, wow, did the Horta do it that way?
What I wanted to mention is that you can see the changing attitudes in society. It's also true about polyamory, but also about homosexuality. It's like, if you read fan fiction from the 60s and 70s and 80s, even though there are slash fan fiction, there of course were a lot of slash fan fictions about Kirk and Spock, they were usually depicted as keeping their relationship low key. It wasn't illegal, but it still wasn't very acceptable even in the 23rd century. People still couldn't really imagine a world where it's as acceptable as a male-female relationship.
I think that has to do with the 60s ideology, just the 60s themselves. Because I don't feel that Star Trek is portrayed that way anymore.
But that's why I said that's how fan fiction was written in the 70s and part of the 80s, because it was still kind of like, yeah, it's not illegal anymore, but people don't go around like acting like it's completely normal like they do today.
Oh, right. Okay, I get where you're going with that. So you're talking about how people represented sexuality outside of your average heterosexuality in fan fiction versus the way they do today.
Like in a lot of fan fiction from that era, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, you can see Spock and Kirk enter a relationship, and like it's not like illegal. They don't hide from the law, but they also don't like,
But they don't
yeah,
call
they still
attention
keep it low key,
to
and
it.
it's not because like they're working, and it's you can't say you can't have a relationship in work environment, but because they know it's not acceptable because they're two men.
I also find it interesting just with the way Vulcans are portrayed, let's say with
Yeah,
their biology, right? When they go through the pon farr and they're literally have to mate or die. There's a lot of fan fiction out there, probably older fan fiction that's, portrays the Spurk relationship as almost taboo in Vulcan society because of the fact that they are almost biologically required to have sex with a female. The males are. I mean, nowadays people just use that as a trope to get
yeah,
Kirk and Spock to hook up because it doesn't matter what gender you are. He just needs to have
yeah.
sex so he doesn't die. To your point, I think you're right. The representation was almost still a little bit closeted.
And it's also there's a lot of debate.
Like we talk about it, but we don't really draw attention to it. And therefore, we think this in the 23rd century, maybe they're not as progressive as they claim to be, and they're not quite there yet.
I think maybe people didn't even see it as a clause of progress. Like it's not on the same par as racial equality or gender equality.
Well, racial equality was the
Exactly,
highlight of the
and gender
60s.
equality too. Yeah,
And gender
yeah.
equality was the runner-up.
But no one really thought about like LGBT acceptance in terms of like in those terms, in terms of racial and gender
Yeah.
equality. A lot of people still thought it was like a choice or whatever. And
Which is interesting because if you talk about modern day fan fiction writers, it is kind of accepted when you write a Star Trek fan fiction, right? That oh yeah, everybody of all races, it's cool. Everybody of all genders, no gender, it's cool. And yet there's still so they still seem to draw more attention to the sexuality than they
yeah,
do anything else.
and it's also interesting you mentioned like the Ponfar and Vulcans. It's also interesting that writers can't agree if Vulcans actually approve of same-sex relationships if they find them logical enough, because Vulcans don't believe in emotions. I guess they think that the only logical relationships would be the ones that are meant to reproduce.
Right. In Beyond, in the rebooted movie, you have Spock who is concerned about his race and he's thinking about ending his relationship with Uhura just for the fact that he feels he should
Yeah.
go reproduce because there's so little Vulcans left. They're now an endangered species practically. It's just logical, right? It's
Yeah.
logical that he goes and produces little Vulcans.
Well,
Yeah, so I could see how they would have that. There would be this theory that, Vulcans don't necessarily accept what they would consider an unordinary union because it's not
yeah,
meant
but at the
for
same time, you
reproduction.
have like Sarek, who at a very old age married a younger woman, which he didn't reproduce with because their relationship is actually kind of portrayed like if you only accepted like unions because of reproduction, then what is the point of that one?
Now we're kind of getting into the topic of just arranged
Yeah,
marriage. Because that brings to mind, Sarek's first marriage with the princess, whoever she was, that produced Cybok.
what is the logical purpose of a princess?
I think it just made it seem important.
I guess.
So, but clearly, he doesn't he doesn't stay in that relationship with the Vulcan princess even after they have a child together, because he eventually ends up with Amanda Grayson. And then, as you said, once Amanda Grayson has passed on, then he, is in a third marriage with someone. I have no clue. I mean, this just goes back to the whole Vulcans are so mysterious, because they're so mysterious they can not only not talk about, not talk to outsiders about traditions and whatnot. The writers can't even clue us in, right? So we don't know, why does Sarek get married a third time? Is it because he needs does he need to be bonded with somebody? Is that a requirement for his, stability, his mental health? Or does he just feel like getting married to somebody? Is he pressured into it? Nobody knows.
And, it ties also into the subject of polyamory, because it raises the exact same issues. There weren't that many polyamory fan fiction like in the 80s, 60s, 70s. But
tell me about it. Where was the McSpurk? It never existed. That's why we're trying to make up for that in this day and age.
Because if gay relationship were barely acceptable, so polyamorous gay relationship, well, that's just unheard of.
Forget it.
But it's still interesting because the older the work is, there are a few works from maybe the early 2000s and such. It seems like it's also not very acceptable, like the polyamory, like maybe gay relationship would be acceptable, but between three people, we don't know.
I think of a polyamorous relationship, a gay one is even less accepted than, say, one between two males and a female, or two females and a male. I don't, you don't see a whole lot of that per se in Star Trek fandom, but if you're looking outside the Star Trek fandom, a gay polyamorous relationship is kind of unheard of. I think McSpurk should be number one out of all the fandoms, because I can't say that I've ever seen it outside of Star Trek.
Well, the thing is that if you have a polyamorous relationship where all sides are into each other, so it has a gay component. It has to have one.
I meant when I said a gay polyamorous, I meant completely of one sex, of one gender. That's where I was going with that. You see a mix.
Yes.
You're more likely to see a mix of genders than you are to see of straight one gender.
I'm trying to think. I really don't.
Yeah.
In all the fandoms I've been to up to this day, there really aren't that many prominent ones. Well, it's not like McSpurk is the most prominent ship in this fandom, but
Oh, by far it's not the most prominent. It's certainly the most interesting, in my opinion.
That's why you're here.
Exactly.
But, it's interesting that I think a lot of writers also don't really know how to handle them. Not the characters specifically, but like a polyamorous relationship. Because, most people don't have experience personally with a polyamorous relationship. So they're like, if they usually write based on their experience with relationships, they're drawing blanks here. Balancing a relationship with it can
three or more.
Can get very different. How do you divide time? How do you? Everything is built for two at the end of the day.
It seems that way, but I think that's what makes it. That's what makes it more fascinating and more challenging, is when you're trying to understand how the give and take really works between three people, such that all three of them are happy and not one of them feels left out.
Because a lot of them, when you read McSpurk fan fiction, it does feel like one of them is kind of a third wheel.
Okay, let's not get on the third wheel syndrome, because I will get upset and then spend the next 2 hours just talking about why third wheel syndrome is the worst. Here's a question for you, Soda. At what point do you think polyamorous relationships will be as accepted as homosexuality is in, say, entertainment today?
It's an interesting question, because unlike homosexuality, polyamory is actually, it's kind of an inverse relation, where in places where homosexuality is illegal, polyamory is usually legal. I mean, mostly polygyny. Polygyny, one man marrying several women.
Yeah.
So there's this really weird inverse relationship. But I think in the West, well, polyamorous marriages are illegal, but like no one is stopping like a group of people from having a relationship if they want to. I think with polygyny is that like there is the the partners have status. Like there is the first woman who is like the head honcho, and there's like the second woman who is lesser, and it's it can get very ugly when it comes to like inheritance and child custody and all of those things. Which is why I think polyamory, as it develops in the West, like as an equal relationship, not like you are the main partner, the secondary partner kind of thing. It poses very hard.
It doesn't have levels of
Exactly.
status and
So
caste and
it poses a
power. Yeah, I
very
gotcha.
hard legal.
At what point is that type of relationship between three or more people going to be viewed as ordinary, as supposedly homosexuality would be viewed in the
Honestly,
23rd
I think
century?
that once we completely normalize the entire LGBT spectrum, I think it comes with that. Like, if you have like if you have like more than two genders, then why not have like relationship with five people? What's the difference?
Do you think that that is the case as people try to portray Star Trek in the
I think it
23rd
depends on who
century?
is writing. I think, as I said, in earlier fanfics, like from the early 2000s, you would see people like writing them as like not being normal, their relationship not being very normal. But these days, most writers they portray them as like, yeah, it's completely normal, like any other type of relationship between adults.
It's interesting. Again, another spoiler for Beyond. You know that Sulu is
Yeah,
portrayed as gay in Beyond. And on screen, he actually has a scene where he meets his partner and their daughter. Kirk is looking on at them in a
yeah,
very fond way. So I mean, the scene is supposed to portray that Kirk himself is not necessarily in a relationship. He's at a point in his career where he's not certain if he's doing what he's doing as captain is where he should be. And he also, I think, feels a little alone in his burden. And when he sees Sulu rush up to his husband and their daughter, and they all hug each other, he just looks on them like you would at any
yeah.
couple, any family reunion, right? You're happy for those people to be seeing each other again after a long period of separation. And so there's nothing cast on that scene that makes it feel like homosexuality is anything other than normal in that day and age.
The other series beside the original series, like Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, even Discovery. I mean, Discovery is at the same time as the original series, and they have a main gay couple. It's not like it's portrayed as something that is weird or abnormal. They're just like a couple.
Right. It's not even a question
Yeah,
of whether it's unusual or not. It's just, part of,
yeah.
diversity in the 23rd century, which kind of brings up the question of whether or not Kirk is actually pansexual, because that's a pretty
Yeah.
popular fan
He might
theorem
be.
or
Well, we
theory.
don't know because he never showed any type of attraction to anyone who didn't look like a female.
Yeah, that's very true. But you have Simon Pegg, as you know, who's one of the writers on Beyond, who
Yeah,
states that Kirk is
yeah.
pansexual, or that he should be. It's hilarious because fans these days, whether they're writing stories or just talking about it, kind of tend to accept that that is just Jim Kirk.
Yeah, like there is nothing else I have to say about it besides, yeah, this is a popular Fanon that people kind of assume that Kirk is into everyone.
It's not even a question of the gender is, or what they look like or what their race is. It all works, right? So that's kind of the tone of the reboot movies, which actually is pretty nice. But again, that's one of those self-correcting things about Beyond that made it
Yeah.
so much better than the first two movies. What kind of conclusion would we draw on this one, Soda?
Well, the original series, I think the conclusion in general from the entire conversation is that the original series tried to be as progressive as it could. Considering the time and the fact that it was a cable television show, not cable, like a television show, that it had the limitations of television shows of the 60s. They couldn't really do whatever the hell they wanted and get away with that. They even had a hard time portraying like a small kiss between a white man and a black woman. But they tried.
Yes, because they tried to cut that scene out, right?
Yeah.
And
But
the
they tried.
network
They tried
executives
to be
didn't want to air
feminist.
it.
They tried to be progressive. They tried to be inclusive. And I don't fault them for not including enough. They tried their best they could.
Because of that, they I think, made it acceptable
Yep.
in the fandom to be as progressive as possible. I don't think Star Trek fans have ever not tried to push the envelope.
Well, I met a few Star Trek fans that made me question if they ever saw the show in the first place. But in general, yeah, yeah.
They weren't
In general,
open-minded enough.
most fans, yeah, do really take inspiration from the progressive spirit of the show.
Yes, exactly. That's what I was going for. Star Trek seems to be all-inclusive when it comes to, or however it is a person sees themselves.
I think the show would continue being more and more progressive the more time will go on, and our perception as a society about what is progressive will go on.
Well, it's nice that we can have a platform, a show that reaches so many people that allows that kind of message, is not hampered by being progressive. Well, I just want to say thank you, Soda, for this great conversation. Next time, we're going to talk about McSpurk from different perspectives, different questions, things like who gets together first, friends to lovers, and other tropes. We'll discuss past loves and relationships. We'll even talk about third wheel syndrome. I hope folks join us for the next podcast. Thanks, everyone.